Good afternoon. I'm here with my guest and fellow Begelbard, Daniel Lynn Watt. Daniel has a new book out, History Lessons, a memoir of growing up in an American communist family. Let me just read a brief introduction to Dan. Dan is retired from a long career as a teacher and educational leader in science, mathematics, and technology. He was a pioneer in educational reform movement, hands-on, minds-on science and mathematics education, and educational use of computers. During the 80s, he and his wife Molly were internationally known for their work with the Logo computer language. Dan and Molly are lifelong social justice advocates. In 1998, they are among the founders of the co-housing community in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In this intentional urban community, they collaborate with their neighbors to share resources, reduce their carbon footprint, and live cooperatively. Dan and Molly co-authored, performed, and produced a CD of a historical musical drama, George and Ruth, Song and Letters of the Spanish Civil War. So I was going to ask you, Dan, these memories are from a long time ago. How did you sort of jumpstart your delving into this? So for years, I didn't want to think about growing up communist. I didn't want to talk about it because I grew up in the 50s when I felt it was dangerous if people knew I was growing up in a communist family. They wouldn't like me, or they would reject me, or they'd hurt me, or all kinds of things I imagined that never happened. But so then as an adult and well into middle age, I never talked about it. I just didn't know how people would take it if I told them, that I had come from a communist family and that I had a lot of pride about a lot of it. So when I retired, I joined the Harvard Institute for Learning and Retirement, which is a lifelong learning collaborative in Cambridge, part of Harvard Extension. And they offered a memoir course. And in the memoir course, people write stories, really, and share them and talk about them. And to some extent critique them, but mainly share them and talk about them. So I decided I wanted to write about my grandfather, Morris. My grandfather... He built a fairly big business, didn't he? Yeah. No, this was this was a grandfather who was a union man.
Oh, okay.
Worked for a union. He sang union songs. He was from an English Jewish family. And he also sang music hall songs, English music hall songs. So I started writing about my grandfather and some of the things I learned from him. And what I found out when I started sharing this was people found this very interesting. They felt they didn't know anything about what it was like to be a communist child, to be in a communist family.
So how did you get back into your memories and all this
stuff? Well, part of it is when you start thinking about these things, other memories come back to you. And this happened to me as well.
Works, yeah.
Also, I have, fortunately, like myself, my parents were hoarders. Not in the material sense, but they were hoarders of documents and scrapbooks and
not Collier Brothers hermits, kind
What's
of.
that?
Not Collier Brother hermits.
No. But we have a lot of. I found a lot of materials that reminded me of things that I hadn't known about. I wrote about my father being away at war in World War II, and I came across a scrapbook that my mother had put together when my father was in the service.
And he was in the Spanish Civil War.
He was also in the Spanish Civil War, and also my family had saved his letters from the Spanish Civil War, which is what allowed Molly and myself to do that show that we did, the Songs and Letters of the Spanish Civil War. So
this is valuable archival material.
That's right, yes.
Did you put it in an archive?
Yes. Actually, we've donated the material to an archive at New York University, at NYU. Right. There's a library at NYU called the Tamiment Library, and it is set up to archive materials from the Americans who fought in the Spanish Civil War, also from labor history, socialist history, and communist history. And I have
donated all my family papers, letters, and things.
So it's a Dan Watt collection?
It's called the Watt Family Collection.
Oh, yeah.
And it's about both my father and my mother's letters and some photographs. And I'm planning to donate some clippings and some other materials that I used while I was writing the book. Some of those things I have not turned over to
I
them.
love archiving things, and I wished I saved more for my family. I mean, I have other stuff, but yeah.
So I was fortunate. And a lot of the things I didn't know that I had. There was an incident when I was growing up, when I was a young child. There was an incident that took place in Freeport, New York. It was a racial incident. It was so familiar to things that have happened in recent years, where a policeman shot 2 brothers. They shot at 4 brothers, African-American brothers, and killed 2 of them. And it was a huge incident at the time. It was considered, by the black community, it was considered a lynching. And the communists organized with the blacks in Freeport, Long Island, where our family was living, to try to protest this and to try to get justice for the family. And I remembered vaguely that this had happened. But while I was writing started working on the book, was clearing out some boxes of family papers, and I came across a manila envelope. It said, Ferguson case, Freeport. And in it were clippings, letters that were written, advertisements that were posted in the papers seeking justice for the Ferguson family. This was what enabled me to write that story, because I certainly didn't remember enough of it to have written it just from my own memory. And when I tried to look for information about it, this incident has been largely forgotten.
Really?
There's very few references to it. I could only find like 2 references for it on the internet. I found a few pages about it in someone's, in a book that's had been
newspaper archives. You didn't find anything in?
Well, I didn't go into the newspaper archives. I would have found things in the newspaper archives, but that's another whole story of research.
Yeah.
And I'll talk about that in a minute. But so I found information. I found the scrapbook of the letters my father sent me when he was at war, or actually when he was in the Air Force, not actually at war, but really when he was in training camp and things like that. So I was able to reconstruct that, how that felt to be a little boy getting those letters from my father. And I found many things like that that helped me, jogged my memory and helped me write the book.
Now, do you resent in any sense that you had this communist upbringing that seeped into every aspect of your child, almost at times robbing you of the freedom of childhood? Do you think, or is there any aspect of that I'm hitting on?
Yes, no, I think that's true. Our family believed in being politically active, obviously. My parents were open communists. They were not. My father actually was an official of the Communist Party, so he was known to law enforcement, the FBI, etc.
It's underground and all that.
So one of the ways that that this impacted my family was that at a certain point, the federal government started arresting the leaders of the Communist Party and putting them on trial for what they called conspiracy to teach and advocate the overthrow of the government. And
that was under the Smith Act.
There was a law called the Smith Act, which is still on the books. And
is it ever used anymore?
I don't believe it's been used since the 1950s, when it was used against Trump, the communists. Let's see, how can I say this? It was one of the tools that the government used against the Communist Party. And if you think about it, if you at all familiar with the history of that period, there were all kinds of ways that communists were harassed and persecuted. There were congressional committees that called people in and asked them to testify about whether they had ever been communists, or to name the names of other communists. There were state and local committees like that as well, not just national committees, but New York State had its own committees to investigate communism. And so there was a sense of I had a sense of foreboding as a child that I didn't want my friends, my neighbors to know, the kids I played with, the kids I went to school with, all the way through high school, even college. I didn't want them to know about this. So
that was probably very reasonable, right? I mean,
well, I thought so at the time, and probably was.
yeah.
But maybe my life would have been different if I had been open about it. There might have been a different kind of dynamic that was more positive than just being afraid.
Okay.
And so just one other thing, since you mentioned this, my father left home for 3 years.
Yes.
When I was 11.
We stayed in Pittsburgh for a while, didn't he?
He stayed in Pittsburgh. He was in Mexico for a while. Mm-hmm. I had no idea where he was. He took me aside before he left, and he said he was going away. He had to go away to do some work for the party, and he didn't know when he'd be back, and that I should just, take care of my younger brother and be helpful to my mother, and that that he would be back when he could. And something he said made me believe that he would be back for my 6th grade graduation. I was in 6th grade at the time. And I kept believing he would be at my 6th grade graduation. And he
never was,
He
right?
didn't come to the graduation. No, of course not. He couldn't. And he probably didn't exactly tell me he would, but he probably didn't want to, he didn't know how long he was going to be away. So anyway, he was away for that long time, and so that was another aspect of impact on my life. So yes, it did have an impact, but the other thing I wanted to get across in this book was that in a lot of ways my childhood was normal. I grew up in New York City. We lived near Central Park. I had friends. We played baseball in the park, played basketball in the schoolyard. We watched TV programs together. We read comic books. We did the things that...
So not everything was political.
We did the things that boys in New York did in those days. We had a lot more freedom than kids today, I think, even though we were in a big city. And
you didn't have play dates and all that
we
stuff.
did not have play dates. We played out on the street, or near the street, or in the park. No adults around.
Unfortunately, I think it's necessary to have play dates these days, some days, It's in some ways.
Yeah, I think it's
a different society.
It's different, and but I think when I think back on that time, a lot of pleasurable memories of being with my friends, and we had indoor games that we played. We had a little community in the neighborhood in New York, a group of kids that hung out together and did things together.
There was one African American kid you were very friendly with.
My best friend was an African American boy named Curtis.
Is he still around, or?
I don't think he is. I tried to find him, or find out anything about him, and I could not find his name anywhere on the internet. I did not go to do research. I believe he joined the military. I did not go research in military records. I might be able to learn something from that. But when I Googled his name on the internet, I came up with his father, who had been an entertainer, African-American entertainer, and his name was, I found pictures of my friend Curtis's father on the internet, because they had the same name.
Unfortunately, he was a drug addict, wasn't he?
He did get involved with drugs at one time, yes.
Now, you, throughout this memoir, there's a lot of song, and song is, is something that be part of the glue that kept your family and the movement going. Tell me about this.
So this is one of the things I learned writing the memoir, actually. People used to ask me, how did you know what it meant to be a communist kid? As a kid. I suppose it's the same for somebody who grows up in a church community or in a synagogue. Their parents tell them things, their families tell them things. They get brought into the family culture and the things the family knows. But for me, one of the things I discovered was that a lot of my learning came from songs. And it came from songs that my family sang. It came from songs that my grandfather was a union man. He sang a lot of union songs. It came from songs I learned at camp. I went to a camp that was we called it progressive kids. This was kids of not only Communist Party people, but people that one way or another were somehow allied with or sympathetic to communism. They may not have been members of the Communist Party, but anyway, kids from that community went to this camp. And that was a place where I felt safe because I knew all the other kids knew about my family and I knew about their families in many cases. And so we felt safe.
Well, I mean, think of it, when I went to camp, we sang a lot of songs and it was a way to bond. So, but except that, ours were like. And
we learned through that. I mean, I remember learning songs at camp, labor songs, civil rights songs, peace songs.
But in your family, too, they were always
in my family, too. Right, right. So, I have a story about that, which I can read later, about my father singing to me when I was 6 years old and learning from it. And, I mean, maybe I should read that now.
I just wanted to get a few
sure, go ahead, yeah.
We got about 12 minutes.
Okay.
So perhaps we can go over to you were part of the Zanies at Cornell. What was that? That was a radical group, kind of?
It was in the 1960s. A movement grew up among young people that came to be called the New Left, in quotes. The old left, let's say the communists, the old Socialist Party, these were very disciplined organizations that demanded you believe certain things. I mean, if you were a communist, you had to believe in Marxist theory. I won't go into that
Stalin
now.
Purges that
you have to believe that Stalin was the leader of the world's workers.
Okay.
You had to believe things like that if you were a communist, and it was very disciplined, and you were supposed to follow the party discipline. If you disagreed with something, you were out, and you were also out of the community of people that joined together. So it was a big deal. The New Left was people that were concerned about things that we felt were wrong with our country. We were very much opposed to the war preparations and the preparations for nuclear war. So we worked on disarmament issues.
Vietnam was just getting started.
Vietnam had not gotten started yet when the Zanies came around. Okay. The Zanies were a group of very loose group, not a tight-knit group, but a loose group of radicals at Cornell University who wanted to work on civil rights, wanted to work on world peace issues mainly. Those were our main issues. And the name the Zanies came in an odd way that one time there was a protest from some African students at Cornell about the assassination of an African leader, Patrice Lumumba, who had been assassinated. And the students were protesting, and some of the radicals at Cornell had joined them, and someone wrote a letter to the newspaper complaining that here are these ubiquitous montage of Zanies, they said, that come out whenever there's something to criticize about the United States. And so we decided, yes, we would be the Zanies.
Okay.
We used that name for ourselves, and we were very active. We were actually very effective in politics at the Cornell campus. We organized a peace campaign for Congress, a campaign for Congress. We organized a civil rights project in Tennessee. And we eventually got a lot of respect on campus.
Now, speaking of song, I mean, I have these old recordings of Paul Robeson,
Yeah.
you know, Old Man River and all that
Yeah.
stuff. Of course, I never seen him. But tell me, he was a great inspiration with deep bellowing voice
Yes.
and all that. Maybe you can tell us something about that.
Robeson was one of my heroes
Okay.
as a child.
Okay.
And of course, he sang songs. He sang not just spiritual songs or show. Old Man River was a show song, but he sang political songs. And I have a vivid
Joe Hill,
memory
yeah.
that I wrote about him singing "I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill Last Night," singing it at a rally in Madison Square Garden.
Wow.
And the way his voice echoed through that building, the way the song meant so much to me because it was a song my parents had sung me, my father had sung me when I was little.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. Joe Hill was a union leader in the 19 teens who was framed for as a robber and executed by a firing squad in Utah in 1916. And this song was written about Joe Hill, about his spirit continuing. And I didn't learn till many years later that Joe Hill himself was a songwriter. He wrote dozens of songs
Okay.
for the labor movement, the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, in the early 1900s.
Now, I want to give you a chance to read
Yeah.
something. We got about, well, what do we have, about 6 or 7 minutes, so.
Okay, I will read something that
I won't have to
bears on
interrupt
this
you.
issue
Yeah.
of song. Okay,
Shorter than longer.
yeah. So this is when I was 6 years old. My father had been in the Air Force. I was born in 1940. When I was just turning 2 years old, he was drafted and went into the Air Force.
Okay.
When my father came home from the Army Air Corps in September 1945, it was his job to put me to bed any night he was home for dinner. I had my own bedroom now on the second floor of our wood frame house at 401 Pine Street in Freeport, Long Island. It was still summer. Pale light filtered in through my open dormer window. I heard occasional shouts from the big kids playing in the streets. 5, 10, 15, 20, anyone around my base is it. My father sat on the side of my bed, telling the story of how he escaped from the Germans after his B-17 was shot down in Belgium, or playing Spanish Civil War songs on his mandolin and singing them in English, Spanish, and German. When I hear those songs today, I can feel his lean torso pressing against my legs. I wanted the feeling to last forever, just the two of us, several nights a week, the last year we lived in Freeport before moving to New York City. His flat-bottomed Serenader mandolin, a mail-order model, picked up in a pawn shop, was always old and scratched, like our 1933 Plymouth. He played by ear, could pick up a tune after hearing it once. The notes rang out with the vibrato produced by moving his pick up and down over the double strings. His right hand moved so fast that he seemed to be striking each note just once. But when he held a note, I saw the tiny, rapid up and down movement of his hand, producing that incomparable mandolin sound. When he sang, his mandolin fell silent. He couldn't play and sing at the same time. Play the melody, sing a verse and chorus or two, then play again. As he played and sang Spanish Civil War songs, Viva la Quince Brigada, Los Cuatro Generales in Spanish, he'd stop to explain what the words meant. I learned about the Spanish Civil War, about the International Brigade and the Lincoln Battalion, made up of the Americans who fought in Spain. My father told me he'd been a commissar, a rank equivalent to major in the U.S. Army. He knew a lot of different songs. Sometimes he sang Union songs, Solidarity Forever, Joe Hill, The Horse with the Union Label. Other times he'd play and sing Tumbalalaika in Yiddish. That was Grandma and Grandpa's, his parents' favorite song. They sang it to him when he was a kid. One of his favorite songs was Kevin Barry, Irish song. The chorus made no sense to me. Shoot me like an Irish soldier, do not hang me like a dog. For I fought for Ireland's freedom on that dark September morn. Why did he want them to shoot him? I interrupted. Because hanging was for spies and he was a soldier. He was an Irish revolutionary fighting to free the Irish from British rule. I was still confused. Why did they hang him? Because he wouldn't be a stool pigeon. What's a stool pigeon? Someone who tells the police who his comrades are and where they live. He sang the second verse. Just before he faced the hangman in his lonely prison cell, British soldiers tortured Barry just because he would not tell all the names of his companions, other things they wish to know. Turn informer and we'll free you. Proudly Barry answered no. You see, he wouldn't tell them the name of his comrades. That's why the British hung him. But his comrades were able to escape and fight again, and eventually Ireland won its freedom from England, just like we did in 1776. Kevin Barry was only 18, just a kid, but already a revolutionary hero. I had learned a lesson in communist morality. Revolutionaries are good, and it's dangerous to be one. Stool pigeons are bad. You can learn important stuff from songs. I still did not understand why Kevin Barry wanted the British to shoot him.
So, Dan, when I went to BU in the 70s, I had the philosophy professor of Dr. Martin Luther King, Bertucci, Dr. Bertucci. Tell me brief. You got about a minute. Your impressions of King. I know that's
of King.
Martin Luther King.
I had the privilege of hearing Dr. King when I was 16. He gave a sermon in a big cathedral in New York City, in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And I had never heard him. He was not known at the time. This was when 1956. He was not well known. He was not nationally known, certainly. He was a Southern civil rights leader. And I went to this cathedral, and the cadence of his speech, the way he spoke about revolution, the way he used Bible stories to simulate a mass movement, made a huge impression on me and made me feel at a time when I was kind of disillusioned with communism, because I was 16, communism was falling apart for me. I didn't really believe it was effective at all. But I heard Dr. King, and I believed that this movement could succeed. And that made a huge impression on me.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us here on Poet to Poet Writer.